Imagine waking up in a city where the fate of millions depends on the murmur of its streets. Where emperors rule from marble palaces, and beggars sleep under the shadows of the Colosseum. Welcome to Rome. For more than 200 years, between 27 BC and 180 AD, ancient Rome lived its most glorious age. A period of stability, expansion, and splendor known as the Pax Romana. The empire seemed invincible. Wars subsided. Architecture flourished. Civilization reached astonishing heights. But, what was it really like to live in that Rome? What did it feel like to walk through its crowded streets? To smell its markets, sleep in an insula, bathe with strangers, watch a gladiator die for entertainment? This is not a documentary. It's a journey into the beating heart of the most powerful empire of antiquity. Today I'll show you what it was like to live in ancient Rome during its golden age. And by the end of this video, you'll know whether you would have survived there. Rome was not just a city. It was a living organism. It breathed, roared, boiled. At the dawn of the empire, it was already immense. But under Augustus, its population reached colossal numbers, over 800,000 souls. And in the 2nd century AD, under the Antonines, it's estimated that more than 1 million people were crammed between columns, temples, smoke, and bricks. Rome was a magnet for merchants, artisans, retired soldiers, prostitutes, bureaucrats, pilgrims, and slaves from all corners of the empire. From the coasts of Africa to the islands of the Aegean. From Hispania to Syria. In every street, 1,000 tongues were spoken. And every god had an altar. The squares smelled of wine, sweat, and freshly baked bread. The cries of vendors competed with the chants of poets. And the sound of carts over worn stone set the city's rhythm. Rome was a mix of nobility and filth, of glory and disease, of white marble and open sewers. It was majestic, yes. But also brutal. Chaotic. Unbearable. And yet, no one wanted to be outside of Rome. Because being inside, meant feeling you were part of the heart of the world. In Rome, your home didn't just say who you were. It also told how much your life was worth. Most lived in insulae, huge multi-story buildings made of wood, plaster, and cheap brick. They rose like human beehives, unstable, dirty, dangerous. A poorly extinguished candle or an overheated kitchen, and the whole place would burn in seconds. Thousands of families shared thin walls, shaky staircases, with no running water or private bathrooms. Overcrowding was the norm. The poor slept packed together, among shouts, dampness, and pests. Diseases spread quickly. And when fires came, there was nowhere to run. But just a few streets away. The richest lived in domus, single-family houses with open atriums, mosaic floors, decorative fountains, and interior gardens. They were miniature palaces. There, silence was a luxury. Meals were served by slaves. Walls were adorned with frescoes. And the baths, private. The more important the citizen, the deeper and more hidden their domus was. Far from the noise, protected by walls, columns, and shaded courtyards. Rome was a city where marble and misery coexisted. Where the windows of the rich didn't face the streets. Because looking down was a reminder that the empire also had basements. In Rome, bathing wasn't just a routine. It was a ceremony. A mix of hygiene, prestige, relaxation, and power. Public baths, the famous thermae, were the social heart of the city. There, everyone gathered, from slaves to senators. All half-naked, sweating, rubbing themselves with oils and bronze scrapers called strigils. The thermae were vast complexes with cold rooms, frigidarium, warm rooms, tepidarium, and hot rooms, caldarium. There were pools, saunas, gyms, gardens, libraries, and even places to eat or close business deals. Bathing was public. The body was political. And nudity, part of the protocol. While the rich were attended by their servants, the poor oiled and scraped each other. It wasn't elegant, but it was communal. And free, or almost, because the state funded many baths as a symbol of imperial generosity. But there was another liquid even more precious. Urine. The Romans discovered that the ammonia it contained was useful for washing clothes, disinfecting utensils, and whitening fabrics. Laundry workers, called full ones, stomped on stained sheets, soaking them in vats of fermented urine. The practice was so useful that Emperor Vespasian imposed a special tax on the urine collected from public urinals. His son Titus was horrified. But Vespasian only raised a coin and said, "Money doesn't smell." And he was right. Neither did Rome. It was a city where marble shone, but also where the stench of the crowds hid beneath perfumes and oils. An empire that smelled of glory, and of humanity. Rome was powerful. Rome was magnificent. Rome was unbearably noisy. The streets were narrow, packed with mule-drawn carts, beasts of burden, street vendors, politicians with escorts, and citizens from all social classes. From dawn until well into the night, the din was constant. The clatter of wheels on cobblestones, the neighing of horses, the shouts of merchants, the murmur of the crowds. All mixed into a cacophony that never slept. Julius Caesar, concerned about the chaos, prohibited carts from circulating in the city center during the day. But the measure only moved the problem to the night. Deliveries, movements, heavy traffic, all took place in the darkness, making nighttime rest almost impossible. The poet Juvenal wrote bitterly, "No one sleeps in Rome except the very rich." The passing of carts and the shouting between drivers banished sleep from anyone. Even so, Roman roads were a marvel of engineering. The famous Appian Way connected the capital to southern Italy, and thousands of other routes linked the empire like a nervous system. "All roads lead to Rome" was not a metaphor. It was a tangible reality. But that connectivity came at a price. The price of noise, of dust, of overcrowding. Rome never rested. And living there was like dwelling in the center of a storm that never stopped. In Rome, not everyone learned to read. But everyone learned their place. There were no public schools as we know them today. The most fortunate, the children of wealthy citizens, were sent to learn with private teachers or tutors, often highly educated slaves brought from Greece or Asia Minor. Education was not a right. It was a luxury, or an investment. First, they learned to read, write, and count. Then, if the family had the means, they moved on to higher studies, rhetoric, philosophy, law, literature. The goal, to turn the boy into a future magistrate, orator, or politician. But they did not go alone. Wealthy youths were accompanied by their pedagogus, a slave responsible for carrying their books, watching over them, and, if necessary, punishing them. Discipline was severe. Knowledge was a way to shape the soul, or to dominate it. In contrast, children from lower classes had no access to teachers. They learned what they could at home and soon joined their parents' trades, bakers, potters, tanners, soldiers. Girls, for their part, were even more limited. They were taught to read and write, only if their father deemed it necessary. Above all, they were prepared for marriage, obedience, and household tasks. Knowledge was masculine. Submission, feminine. Nevertheless, some elite women, educated in secret or by their father's will, managed to excel in poetry, music, or medicine. But they were exceptions, not the rule. Education in Rome was also a tool of control. The rich prepared their sons to rule. The poor, to obey. And still, every Roman, cultured or illiterate, grew up knowing that glory was reserved for those who served Rome, with discipline. In Rome, a woman was not a citizen. She was a daughter, a wife, or a shadow. She could not vote. She could not hold public office. And with few exceptions, she did not participate in political life. The Roman woman existed under the guardianship of a man, her father, her husband, or even her own son. Her role was clear: obey, tend the home, and perpetuate the family line. Wealthy women lived in spacious domus, surrounded by servants. They spent their days among embroidery, banquets, gatherings with friends, morning shows, and devotion to household gods. They had time, but no freedom. Privileges, without power. Women of the middle or lower classes, on the other hand, worked as wet nurses, midwives, market vendors, cooks, or peasants. And many others, with no options or protection, fell into prostitution, legal but stigmatized. The female body in Rome was useful, desired, but rarely valued. A few women escaped the mold. The Vestal priestesses, for example, dedicated their lives to the cult of Vesta, the goddess of the sacred fire. Chosen as girls, they lived 30 years in chastity. Respected, feared, but isolated. Even so, many women found ways to exert influence. From the shadows, they managed fortunes, forged family alliances, and raised sons who would become consuls or emperors. Their power was silent, but real. In a society built by men, some women knew how to pull the strings between the columns. Rome didn't just conquer territories. It also raised temples. Because every city it dominated had to worship like Rome. The Romans were intensely religious. Their days began with offerings. Their decisions were guided by omens. And in every home, a sacred flame burned. In houses, the Penates and the Lares, gods of the home and of the ancestors, received bread, wine, or flowers. Small domestic altars maintained the spiritual harmony of the family. It was the father who led the rituals. Religion was not a choice. It was part of family duty. But beyond the walls of the home, a monumental religiosity spread. Marble temples, imposing columns, public festivals, processions. Mars, Jupiter, Venus, Minerva. The Roman pantheon didn't just explain the world. It also legitimized power. The emperor was not only a ruler. He was a demigod. The imperial cult required citizens to offer incense to his image, in temples built in his honor. Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian, all were worshipped. Faith was obedience. And to deny the imperial cult was treason. Even so, Rome tolerated foreign religions as long as they did not challenge the state. That is why it accepted Egyptian, Syrian, and Persian cults. But Christianity, with its single God and its rejection of the emperor, ignited a conflict that would change history. Roman religion did not demand absolute devotion. Only respect, and loyalty to order. Thus, Roman spirituality was a balance between the public and the private, the ancestral and the political, the mystical and the functional. Rome did not only build empires of stone. It also built empires of faith. In Rome, being a citizen was a privilege, but not necessarily a voice. Roman citizenship was not a universal right. It was a status. A reward for loyalty, a political tool, a social barrier. For centuries, only those born in the city of Rome could call themselves citizens. But as the empire grew, thousands of people in Italy and the provinces fought for that title. Being a citizen meant more than voting. It meant not being a slave. It meant having legal rights. It meant being part of the body of the empire. You could vote, access public office, marry legally, and be judged under Roman law. But not all citizens were equal. The Patricians, the noble class, dominated the Senate and the high offices. The Plebeians could elect representatives, yes, but their influence was minimal. The Senate was powerful, but not representative. The people were numerous, but not decisive. Over time, emperors like Tiberius and Claudius extended citizenship to allies, soldiers, and annexed peoples. Not out of generosity, but strategy, to increase loyalty to the empire. The census, held every 5 years, was the mechanism to confirm that status. Citizens had to register, declare property, children, and titles. Those who did not, lost their place. Roman citizenship was a mark of belonging, but also of control. And yet, millions lived outside that system, slaves, women, foreigners. Only in the 3rd century, under Caracalla, was citizenship granted to all free men of the empire. But by then, real power was far removed from the ballot boxes. In Rome, the people had a voice, but the empire shouted louder. In Rome, the emperor ruled the empire. But at home, the paterfamilias ruled. The Roman family was not just a social unit. It was a political and religious institution. And at its center stood the father. The paterfamilias. He not only managed business affairs and administered property. He was also the priest of the household, the judge of his children, the educator, and, if he wished, the executioner. Legally, he held the power of life and death over his wife, children, and slaves. He could repudiate his wife for economic or moral reasons. He could sell his children into servitude if there were debts. He could even order their death if he deemed they had dishonored the family. A figure blending respect, fear, and devotion. When a daughter married, authority over her passed from her father to her husband. And if a man had no male heirs, he could adopt one, a nephew, a promising young man, or even an adult. Blood was less important than the continuity of the lineage. But the paterfamilias did not only wield authority. He was also responsible for preserving tradition. He led rituals to the Lares and Penates, tended the household altar, and guided the family spiritually. Every meal, every decision, every celebration, carried a religious gesture. Because in Rome, piety began at home. Over time, some of these powers diminished. But the principle remained: the Roman household was no democracy. It was a miniature republic, where the father's will was law. In the most powerful empire in the world, true authority began, at the family table. Rome did not last 1,000 years because of its army, but because of its way of living, and dreaming. Between 27 BC and 180 AD, Rome reached its greatest splendor. The Pax Romana brought peace to an empire of many languages, faiths, and landscapes. Aqueducts, circuses, temples, and roads, still standing today, were built. Texts were written that continue to inspire us. It was a civilization of marble and blood, of philosophy and sword. In that era, monuments such as the Colosseum, Trajan's Forum, and Hadrian's Wall were born. Laws were enacted that would become the foundation of Western legal tradition. And a culture capable of integrating the Greek, the Egyptian, the Gallic, the African, into a single Roman identity took shape. It was a universal, ambitious, almost divine Rome. But that greatness came at a price. Opulence fed excess. Peace concealed tensions. The city grew beyond what it could sustain. And the elites forgot their duty, while the people contented themselves with bread and circuses. Even so, Rome left an incomparable legacy. Its architecture, its language, its organization, its ideas about citizenship, family, and power still live in our cities, in our governments, in our customs. Because Rome was not just a city. It was a way of understanding the world. It was a promise of eternity. And although it fell, it did so slowly. What it left behind never truly disappeared. To live in Rome during its golden age was to be part of something greater than oneself. Something destined not only to endure, but to be reborn, again and again, in every corner of history.